There were 1.1 billion international visitor arrivals across the world in 2013. The United Nations World Tourism Organisation expects this to grow to 1.6 billion by the year 2025, and that represents annual growth of just over 3%. Now, there are some experts in the field who, like the World Travel and Tourism Centre and Deloitte Access Economics, who predict slightly stronger growth, between 4 and 4.5% over the next 10 to 20 years. So the outlook at a global level for tourism is very optimistic. Now, here in Australia, annual growth is expected to be stronger. It's expected to be closer to 5% out till 2025. So if that occurs, our share of global international arrivals will increase over the period to 2025. And it also demonstrates that if we achieve that level of growth, it shows how the prominent role that tourism already plays in the Australian economy will increase. 3/4 of tourism in Australia, or tourism visitor expenditure in Australia, and it was also a very good year for domestic tourism. There were a record 83.2 million domestic overnight trips taken during the year ending June 2015, and overnight visitor expenditure increased by 4% to 55.4 billion. So overall, if we look at total tourism expenditure across international visitors, domestic overnight visitors and domestic day visitors, there was a 5% increase over the year, and we achieved $107 billion in tourism expenditure. So that's a very large one. Previously, the outlook for international tourism to Australia is really bright. Visitor arrivals are expected to reach 10.6 million by 2024-25, and that's annual growth close to 5% per year over that time. And from our surveys, the International Visitor Survey and the National Visitor Survey, that's a little bit tricky. The main proxy we have for a nature-based visitor is if they participate in particular activities on their trip. And I've selected 12 activities which I think you could quite reasonably define as nature-based activities. They include things like visiting national and state parks, visiting wildlife parks, visiting botanical gardens, activities like bushwalking, scuba diving, snorkeling, water-based activities. So they're the sorts of activities I'm talking about. I haven't included things like going to the beach, because what we find with our surveys is that nearly all international visitors and quite a large proportion of domestic visitors go to the beach. So I've left that category. Now, if we look at this slide here, we can see that the first thing that stands out is that international visitors are far more likely to participate in nature-based activities than domestic tourists on their trip. If we look at international visitors, more than 2/3 or 4.5 million participated in at least one nature-based activity during 2014-15. The rate was much lower for domestic travellers or domestic overnight travellers. It was 28%. But the thing we do need to remember is that still represents 23.6 domestic overnight visitors. So for anyone who has a nature-based attraction or an eco-accommodation type arrangement or something like that, the domestic market is still really, really important, because although a lower proportion of domestic travellers undertake nature-based activities, there's still such a large part of the pie. So if we look more closely at nature-based visitors, what we can see is that they tend to have a longer average length of stay than your average international or domestic traveller. So if we look at international visitors to start with, a nature-based international visitor has an average length of stay of 43 nights compared to the average across all international visitors of 36. And although it doesn't seem very different, for domestic overnight travellers, the length of stay is 5 nights for a nature-based visitor compared to 4. And what that means is that when we look at things like share of visitor nights or share of total spend, nature-based visitors' share of those metrics is higher than they are in the visitor. So what we end up with is that nature-based visitors have a higher average spend than is the case for all visitors, be it international or domestic visitors. And if we look across all nature-based visitors across international, domestic overnight, domestic day, they contribute 49 billion to tourism spend in Australia. So that's about 46% of total tourism spend in Australia in 2014-15. So that's a very significant portion. So I'll just look at some of the markets which are important. And if we look at the proportion of visitors from particular international markets who can be classified as nature-based visitors, you can see that it varies from one market to another. So China, UK and Japan have the highest rates of nature-based visitors. So they're up around the 80%. And then the rates are a bit lower for our next three markets, to be Singapore, New Zealand and United States. And if we look at it in terms of the number of nature-based activities that international tourists do, we look at the UK and the US, they undertake the most nature-based activities on average. So the UK, they tend to do 3.2 nature-based activities during their stay, and for the US it's 2.8. And that's followed by China with 2.6. So you can see that these visitors can stay for quite a while, and part of their trip is doing nature-based activities, but they don't tend to do the full spectrum of the 12 that I referred to. For domestic overnight visitors, the proportion who are nature-based doesn't vary much, irrespective of whether they're interstate travellers or intrastate travellers, and they tend to undertake between 1 and 2 nature-based activities